Welcome to an Overseas Press Club webinar. Today, our topic is how Afghan journalists are reinventing themselves. I think that sort of Western media is a teeny bit guilty about neglecting Afghanistan. There was a huge exodus after US troops and Western troops left the country. August 2021 was a chaotic time. I think some of the panelists left at that moment, but what's interesting about all of them, these extremely competent people that you're now going to meet, is they were journalists in Afghanistan and they have become journalists again, but this time in the West. So it's a reinvention. Hopefully it's a rebirth that lasts. I think that as journalists ourselves, we should be paying attention to what they're writing and what they're doing. And we have an hour. I think what I'm going to do is ask each one of them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the work that they're doing. And then I will ask questions for about 30 minutes. I'm going to open it to the floor. You can put your questions in the chat and I'll see them and I will call upon you. But let's first start with Summia. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you're working on now?
Hi, my name is Summia.
Summia, sorry.
No worries.
I even practiced.
So I'm actually one of the only ones who is not a journalist and happened to find myself working with journalists. So I'm from Kabul, and I was actually doing my master's at Oxford when in public policy as a Rhodes Scholar when the Afghan state collapsed and the Taliban took over. During that time, I was heavily involved in helping Afghans who were at risk with supporting with evacuations, but also funding resources for families who needed it, and then went on to work in humanitarian aid. And while I was working with different Afghan families, I realized how there was need for people to understand really what happened before the collapse in terms of the inequities that existed in different provinces, but different communities, and how that could be communicated to a wider audience. So I found myself landing an opportunity with New America. I became a scholar at New America and worked with journalists, Afghan journalists who had been evacuated from Afghanistan and were starting their new lives across the globe. And we went on to work on investigating different actually stories, whether that was in national security or it was refugees, Afghans who were at risk trying to leave the country, following their story. And my team particularly, we produced a podcast that was focusing on three individuals who tried to leave Afghanistan and their story with their families. And it is called No Way Home. It is a production of the Intercept. And through that, we were able to cover stories of Afghan families who were trying to leave the country, who were successful, who failed, and who also are now in a state of limbo. So I would encourage everyone who's listening to this, after this, please go ahead and listen to that podcast and you'll get a better idea of the work that we did. But I'm really glad to be here with everyone. And I will hand it off to Zahra John, if you would like to go. And
let me just say one thing, Summia, you count as a journalist when you've done 4 podcasts. So you're in the tribe. It's okay. Zahra, you can be next, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah, for this great panel, which is very needed. And thank you, Summia, for the great introduction to the work that you have done with journalists and the podcast that you have produced. I can start from the work that I am doing. So basically, my journalism career started in Kabul, Afghanistan in 2011. And until 2017, I was working as a journalist. So most of my time was spent working with local media in Afghanistan. And for last year that I was in Afghanistan, I was working for the New York Times. As I said before, that was like 2016. And when I joined the New York Times, they said I was the first Afghan woman journalist inside the country to work with the mainstream English language media. And that by itself is something to just ponder of like, we were in terms of like who were telling our story to the world. But when I moved to Canada, I somehow wasn't able to get back to what I loved, which was journalism. Because when you move from your country, especially when you move from global south, this is an assumption that your experience, that your knowledge is inferior to those that are in the West. So when you come here and you imagine yourself being a journalist here in the West, like eyes would go like, oh, but you know, like you don't have the experience here, you know, like, and then you get that sense of like, okay, that your experience is not being counted, that is not being counted at all as a journalist. Because this is context is one thing that you can get through progress, through being in an environment, but just not being able, not seeing that your experience being acknowledged is like a difficult experience. And I'm sure that now so many Afghan are experiencing that in all around the world, you know, like their experience, who they were in the past is not being acknowledged. Now their first identity is being a refugee. And if they are lucky, they are living somewhere that's peaceful, at least, that they can start thinking about creating a new life for themselves, something that's not denied to most of them who are still living in limbo. But back to my story, I went back to school. I did a master in communication and culture at York University here in Toronto, Canada. And after that, I started my PhD in women and gender study. And until last August, I was just a PhD student thinking of like imagining myself as an academic in Kabul University teaching at the Department of Gender and Women Studies. And I hope that was really collapsed with the August last year. And after August, so I felt that my work was needed. At the same time, I was working as a freelancer, trying to tell the story of if the Taliban come, what would happen to women. But even before we could publish that story, Taliban already took over, and that story was never published in the way I wanted that to be published. And after that, I became involved with another newsroom called Roshana Media. So I did a fundraising for them. At that time, Afghanistan was collapsing. So I was trying to help them to maintain. And we were thinking that we at least have another year of staying in Afghanistan, of trying to just think that what's happening. But the collapse was so fast. And my friend, Zahra Joy at that time, she was basically in Afghanistan and like being evacuated to London, UK. And at that time, I started working with them at their English website. So we did some great work there. But then I realized that we really need something more, an organization that really focus on women journalists, and also I call the voice of the marginalized, because we do have marginalized populations in Afghanistan that unfortunately do not have access to media, do not have access to public sphere to be able to really bring that's what is suffering to them, what they consider suffering, and the events that are happening in their lives, to be able to tell that stories, because being in the media is by itself a privilege. So of course, those who are coming from the margin don't have that opportunity to be able to tell their own stories, and especially tell your story in the way you want it to be told I think is a very somehow privilege that not all people have. To be able to be women journalists. So we have lots of women journalists, of course, like in the past 20 years, media was a success story of Afghanistan, of the US coming to Afghanistan. That was like a big and huge success story. And so many women journalists, including myself, was able to work in the media during this past 20 years, the opportunity that was created for us. However, even that time, there was so many layers of discrimination that we had to go through. And we were not really able to shape our own stories, to narrate our own stories and tell it the way that we feel that is necessary to be told. But still, we were part of those newsrooms. We were there, we were visible, we were working. But when the Taliban took over, the sudden, of course, was like the collapse of so many of the achievements that was gained in the past 20 years, freedom of media, women's rights, anything that you can name it. We felt that August was the point that somehow it was the end of all of those. And women journalists, I feel, was particularly under attack because, first of all, the attack on women, when the Taliban came, women were their main target in Afghanistan. Their first degrees, their first talks, all about women, what women should wear, how should they dress, whom should they go out with, and where, like, what subject they cannot study in university, the schools, what age they can go to school. So these were all the policies that Taliban brought on women in Afghanistan. But then we have women who are particularly affected by their intersectional identities. And some of those women include women journalists who were being attacked from one part, the fact of being only women, were already intersecting by so many restrictions that the Taliban imposed. But being in the media, because media is another sector that the Taliban particularly targeted, and they issued several regulations saying what media can publish, what they cannot publish, what words they even can use. So considering that, and then being able, like, there's different policies of gender segregations, of like how women can, like, dress when they're on the TV. So this is another layer that even by itself, if the Taliban do not directly dictate to the media to dismiss women journalists, they somehow feel they have to let women journalists go because that's so much cost to keep a gender segregated office, and also having the Taliban in your back that they might come every minute to investigate, like, how women journalists are doing. Are they sitting with the male journalists? Like, so many conversation around that. So that's costly. So media somehow by themselves were forced to, let women journalists go. And now what we are seeing in Afghanistan is that women journalists have been somehow erased from Afghanistan. They might be in their own houses, but they do not have the opportunity to be able to work, to be able to continue to grab to that identity that they have been, like, for so long. At the same time, they lost the ability to put food on the table, to be an independent person, to continue support their family, as well as not having any opportunity, any hope for the future, any purpose to live for. And that all come together is a very, very heartbreaking story. So how can we do, for me and my colleagues, some of us who are in exile? So we came together and we thought, okay, like, what is our role here? What can we really do at this situation? We are all journalists. We know what happened in Afghanistan was heartbreaking, was a trauma for all of us, a trauma that we will carry for generations. However, what is our role right now? What can we do right now to at least contribute, to do something to change it? And we came up with the idea of, like, we can come together and try to support some of those women journalists in Afghanistan to be able to continue their work from their own houses. So right now, what we are doing daily is trying to support a group of journalists, small group of journalists inside the country, for them to be able to bring the information that we want to tell, especially about the lives of women, the lives of LGBT community, especially the environment, the topics that we really see is marginalized. We want our journalists to be able to still continue bringing those stories while trying to minimize the risk for them. And as we work these days, we always consider about not only how to protect our sources, but how to protect our journalists, because that is the big question right now. We are, all of us who are working in the media, is struggling. What's going to happen to my colleague? What should I do? That's even holding a journalism card, identity card, is by itself having the evidence of, like, carrying an evidence that you're a criminal. So like, how do you really deal with that situation is a difficult question for all of us, for the media community in Afghanistan. But again, coming back to women journalists, and when we are knowing that women are the main targets of the Taliban, that they're being erased from public life, and then not having women journalists to be able to tell this story is, I think, by itself a crisis for the media, and also for Afghanistan, of course, because most of the time we always suffer from not having our story told and not being able to shape our narrative. So that's what we are trying to do at Zan Times, to trying to work together with the very minimal resources that we have to be able to bring at least some of those stories to the fore and to tell within ourselves in our own languages, and also for an international audience. I think that's the only thing that we can do, and this is our responsibility to tell the story of women in Afghanistan.
Let's move on to Amu TV. Samiullah Mahdi, you are a former Voice of America correspondent. You've co-founded this television station. Can you tell us what it does? And are you free to broadcast or at least stream what you want into Afghanistan?
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's very nice to be in this panel. I hope you're hearing my voice. Okay.
Yep, we do.
So yeah, I used to work for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is similar to Voice of America, but not Voice of America. I was their bureau chief in Afghanistan for 2 years, and just before the collapse of Kabul, I left the company. And it's interesting that Zahra Jan was working on the question, if the Taliban take over, what will happen to women? At the same time, I was working on the very similar question: if the Taliban take over, what will happen to media? And this was for a project for Harvard University, Kennedy School, Shorenstein Center. And my research was published only after collapse of Kabul. And what's happening today on media and for journalists in Afghanistan, I think a lot of it was predicted in that research, but I have to admit that the situation is much worse than what I had predicted in that research paper. Because in that research paper, my assumption was that the Kabul government will not collapse fully, and Taliban will become, the bigger brother in that government, but we will still have, we will still keep some infrastructures of the state, which unfortunately that didn't happen, and we witnessed the full collapse of the entire state and government and all institutions. It's I will come to your question, but before that I should mention that it's still heartwarming to see that while every institution of the government has collapsed, the national army, the national police, the government itself, the parliament, everything, but media is still standing. We still have media in Afghanistan. And that's an answer to the questions if, if the media is a real achievement of the country. You can just see and, go back to Afghanistan and see that media is still standing. Unfortunately, under severe censorship, under unimaginable censorship, which we didn't experience since the Taliban government from 1996 to 2002. So we are going back to Taliban 1.0, unfortunately. Coming back to your question about Amu TV, just after the collapse of Kabul, I and one of my very close friends and colleague, Lutfullah Najibizadeh, who was the head of Tola News before the collapse, both of us at the end of August 2021, we met in Istanbul, and we discussed the idea of building a new media outlet, because we already knew that we cannot work with domestic media anymore. because they are going to be under Taliban's control anyway, and it's impossible to, do with the kind of journalism that we used to do in Afghanistan. So we started working on that, and then we both came to the United States. I got a work visa from ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists, and Lutfullah got a fellowship at the Chicago University. We got this opportunity to be in the US and work on the idea. Now we are established news channel, TV channel in Virginia, Sterling, Virginia. And we are covering all aspects of life in Afghanistan. We cover human rights, we cover women's rights, and we cover security, politics, and also day-to-day life of the ordinary people across the country. Our focus is, of course, on human rights and women's rights and security, and the regional politics and security across Afghanistan and around Afghanistan. But also, we are not so much, Taliban-centric, because we feel like there is a 40 million people population that we have to cover, and they are still alive, they are living there, and they're, of course, severe conditions, but still the life is going on there. We have a small crew here in Washington, DC, in Virginia, but the majority of our colleagues are in Afghanistan. We have about 24 reporters and editors inside the country. Unfortunately, they operate anonymously without being able to, introduce themselves as the correspondents and reporters of Amu TV. But the fact that we have this level of access inside the country, enables us to produce some very, very important and sometimes very sad reports from the country. For example, a week ago, we unveiled, a report from Panjshir province, where the Taliban had, entered the house and raped an entire family, a woman and her 4 daughters. The Taliban denied, of course, at the beginning. Then, this sound clip of one of the Taliban authorities from Panjshir, was surfaced, and he said that at least the mother was raped by the Taliban. We had a similar report from Kabul, where 2 girls were raped unfortunately by the Taliban in the western parts of the city in Dashti-Barchi. And that's becoming kind of, we can see a trend, unfortunately, in this kind of unfortunate incidents in some areas of Kabul, especially in the west parts of the city. And, reports of, civilians being killed by the Taliban. From Panjshir, from Kabul, from Kandahar, from Nangarhar, from Andarab, and different parts of the country. So that's the kind of work we do. We are present on all platforms online. We established the online presence at the beginning of August. The last time I checked, we had reached 30 million audiences across our platforms, and we are expecting to launch our satellite broadcast in 2 months. Thank you.
Congratulations. I wanted to ask all of you, journalism was, in some ways, you could argue, the most successful thing of, Western occupation of Afghanistan for the last 20 years. You were innovative, you were creative, you were entertaining, you took risks. It was always a joy to think about the kind of journalism and television that was being carried out in Afghanistan. It was terrific, and it is the biggest loss, in my view, after August 2021. Can you keep it alive in the West with, Zan, with Amu TV, with projects through the Intercept? I have heard that the Taliban is already reaching out to some of you and will put text on your phones that says, I know where your mother lives. I know where your brother lives, if they're in Kabul. And so the larger question is, can they reach you, the Taliban, here? And can you keep what you have done alive? I just want to remind our attendees, if you have a question, please put it in the chat and you can ask it. Zahra, so can I call you Zahra John? That is a nice honorific right at the end, right? So do you think that you can keep Afghan journalism alive from here? Are you supported enough? Do you have enough resources? Can you send back to the country the kind of information that people by this time must be hungry for?
Thank you for that question, Deborah. If I'm being honest, the question of funding is always difficult for the people who work on the newsroom and not on the boardroom. So if you don't have the language, the experience, the network, everything, so of course you're left out and it would be on your own. That is one part of the question, which is like a very important part, which we lack, of course, most of as media in Afghanistan, especially the media that are trying to survive in exile, are struggling. However, what I want to see is that us coming together, as trying to work shoulder to shoulder to support the people inside the country and trying, first of all, to bring the story that's happening in Afghanistan. This is very, very difficult. We are talking about a population who left out without any protection. So imagine for women in Afghanistan, I'm just giving like this suffering is on the whole population of Afghanistan, as we get the number that say like 98% of the population don't have enough to eat. So those kind of numbers really show like the level of suffering that everybody's go through it. However, how that's difficult for women in Afghanistan is they are being, particularly for the fact of being women, they are under attack from the Taliban. So for us to be able to tell the story of women in Afghanistan, especially at this time, is very, very important. And it's also a personal struggle for us because we want to tell this story for the next generation. We want to be able to preserve parts of what women in Afghanistan are doing in the face of the most misogynist political forces ever, especially now. There's no country in the world that deny women the right to education that the Taliban does. So how do really women live in this country is a big question. Like when, like I cannot even imagine because I am living in a country that I do have all forms of freedom. That by itself is the fact that you can really feel there's one part that you are ordered to not go to school, to not go to work, to stay at home. And there is one big void is that there is no purpose, there is no hope. We have a recent Gallup survey that says 98% of women and 97% of men do not have hope for the future. Like they see their future as suffering, at getting even worse. So when we are seeing this, that there is so much happening inside the home that you don't really get to know, get to hear in the media. So we are really hoping to be able to preserve that stories. There is struggling, there is, difficulties, but there's will to do this work. And we are a group of, collective of mainly women journalists. We came together. Most of us are working voluntarily. We are putting our time, our energy, our experience, knowledge, trying to support each other. And I see this as a positive positive way of trying, trying to survive. It's a way of survival at this difficult time for us. And I feel that we will survive because we are trying to work together. We are trying to get each other's hand and push for it. Like when I talk to my colleague in Afghanistan, most of them are women. One of my colleagues is actually, she's pregnant. She's becoming a mom soon. And when I talk to her, like she say like, oh, I do this, I do that, I know this is the difficulties. And I will say, like, it's okay, like sometimes a story which might be very risky, we are not going to tell it. But at least there's other stories that you can bring, that you can tell, especially your own story, that you can still work, even if that means not leaving your house, even if that means not being able to get the credit that you deserve for your work. But you're still working, that there is still a hope. So I just want to quote one of my colleagues. She's very young. She lived in a province that told even before the Taliban, there was no journalism being taught in that entire province. So she always wanted to become a journalist, but wasn't able to study journalism in university. And then Zan Times, our media, became a platform for her. We invited her. She became she was an intern. And now she tells me that, look, it's not about always having a job to be able only eat. The purpose is important. The hope is important, that you feel even in this suppression, in this oppression that we all suffocating, that we're all suffering, there's something that I'm doing. There's something that I'm contributing. And I think the Taliban, what they deny to women of Afghanistan is this feeling of being able to be useful for your own society, to be able to contribute back as a human. Like they just are trying to use women as a mainly, like in the service of first, to be able to reproduce as a sex slaves, and also to keep them at the house. And as they treat women like domestic animals. And that should not be the way it should be happening. One thing that I really feel sad about is that we are not seeing that urgency in the media around us, in the media in the world. We are not seeing this urgency. Hey, world, please wake up. This is happening. We are living in the 21st century. We are living in 2022. There's a country that basically deny women the right to exist as human because they are women, because of their sex, because of their gender. How should we put this in another word to be able to get attention? So that is the part that I'm really, really feel, depressed about, to be able to just see this is happening. Because when I was reading Margaret Atwood's book about the Republic of Gilead, I was always thinking like, oh my God, but then I knew that happened in Afghanistan. But at that time, at least we know that there wasn't any social media, there wasn't any media reporting so much details about what's happening and about how Taliban are implementing their misogynist policies on women every day, cutting their human rights every day. We didn't have that stories coming up, but now we do have that stories, but the world still doesn't want to pay attention. There is no urgency of talking about, hey, this is not acceptable. This should not be acceptable. And we really hope for Zan Times. Zan means woman. And Zan Times is really our way of saying that this is our time. And the least we can do in our time is to speak our truth, to really say what is really happening, to be able to collect that stories, to preserve it, to put it somewhere for the next generation, that when they look back, they can judge us by the circumstances that we were living in. And also with that circumstances, how did women in Afghanistan resisted, how they did fight back for their rights. That is one important part of our story. And we really hope, and as long as we can, definitely we will move forward. But what we really hope is for the people of the world to show solidarity, to just came, and wherever they are in the world, I am sure they have some power to exert. They can go to their governments. They can really appeal, especially in the countries who have something to do with Afghanistan in the past 20 years. They have an additional responsibility to really look back and take their governments accountable for what's happening today in Afghanistan and the silence that we are witnessing. So I am hopeful that even despite despite all the hopelessness, despite all the suffering, the media, as we are seeing, they have survived so far, and they will survive. And hopefully we will be able to provide an alternative, thinking space for the people of Afghanistan who are just losing this every, there is no art, there is no music, there is nothing left for the people. So we are trying to create an alternative space to be able to tell a story, as well as trying to create awareness about rights, about how it's necessary to advocate for equality for all. And that by itself is a rejection of the Taliban. And that is the story that we hope to tell. And we are hopeful that we can continue our work.
Summia, you're the Rhodes Scholar, so I'm going to ask you the hard question. And that is, so there is no government in exile. The elites, the political elites are failing you. I don't know exactly why. They fight with each other and they blame each other, but they don't do anything. And so, the Taliban doesn't have any political organization that is pushing back on them. And I wondered if you thought that Afghan journalism is going to have to play that role, because the elites have disappeared. And it's you guys who are, talking about what's happening on the ground, what's happening to women, what the Taliban does to women. I mean, the rape story is terrifying, but the fact that it's out is important. So I wondered if I don't mean for you to answer the question, what is wrong with the elites and what happened to them and why do they fall down and fail? More important is, we know that happened. So does that put more of a burden on Afghan journalism as the only force against the Taliban?
Yeah, I think so. I've actually thought a lot about this question. Yeah, so it's great that you asked that question. And have been discussing with several people who are not only journalists but activists, and also being part of the sort of the political elite group, right? I think you point out something very important, which I think there's a vacuum, right? In terms of what voices are being heard and who's opposing the Taliban. And I think when there's opposition towards the Taliban, groups that are opposing them have different, either they have different opinions about the Taliban, their governance, or certain groups that focus on human rights violation, certain groups who are focused on certain political agendas. So there are different groups working on different issues. And I think journalists play a very important role in ensuring whose voices are being heard and who's being given platform. But I don't think it's only journalists. I think it extends beyond to, international organizations, NGOs. I think even political elites in the United States, political elites everywhere in the world. Who are we giving the platform, and whose voices are we elevating when it comes to the campaigns that are created in terms of regarding Afghanistan, in terms of what issues are being highlighted about Afghanistan. And I think for Afghan journalists, I've seen, working at my time with Intercept and at New America, the journalists that I worked with and the human rights activists I worked with from Afghanistan and researchers who I worked with, all were trying really hard to bring and create that alternative space for us to hear stories of people who are not necessarily heard over the 20 years. I think even when there was journalism over the 20 years in Afghanistan, I think there was emphasis in terms of what type of stories were being, showcased, because there was an intervention of the US in terms of the focus on the progress and maybe not so much focused on the failures. And now there's this reflection phase going on, and I think journalists are also thinking about that, but also different people in different spaces. But I think for us as journalists, it's very important that we push for bringing in the alternative voices. And I'm really glad hearing what Zahra John is doing and what Samiullah John is doing at their work with the outlets that they have. And I think they are trying to create those alternative spaces. And especially with Zan Times, I think they're really trying hard to bring voices of women who might have not been heard over the years, and for us to recognize that there is a need for us to look beyond what we've been looking for answers to, whether those are the political elites, Afghan political elites who are abroad now. I think it's important to not just focus on them and elevate their voices, but also look into people on the ground who are living on a daily basis, the realities of what the Taliban is doing, and really find those people and elevate their voices, because now they're the ones who are at the front lines fighting this battle. And our role as journalists is to elevate their voices and give them platform, not to dictate what should be said or done. And it's the same with international organizations. It is same with, I think, any political groups that are working on Afghanistan. It's very important we listen to those voices on the ground and listen to their stories. So that is something like I would emphasize on, yeah.
Sami, Zahra brought something up that I thought was interesting, and that's this notion that, Western news editors, it's almost a second betrayal, that everybody covered like crazy August 2021, and then nothing. I mean, I've talked to freelance reporters in Kabul who say, I want to do a story about an influencer in Kabul. Nobody's interested, so they're not doing enough about the daily stuff that the Taliban is doing, or just regular life. Here's how people are. Do you feel that it's been a betrayal from Western editors about covering Afghanistan? Hang on, we've lost. You're a little.
Is it better now?
Yes, whatever that was. Yes, magic.
Because we were talking about betrayal. I think even the computer betrays us. So much and on so many fronts that we have lost the count, unfortunately. But that's understandable. Western media follows the Western military in our parts of the world, and Western interest, unfortunately. I don't say that everyone is like that and every outlet has been like that, but the day when Kabul collapsed, if you go and monitor the coverage of international media from Afghanistan, you would see that Afghanistan had become only the airport area. That was Afghanistan. There was no country. There was no population, and Taliban were, killing people at that time in so many parts of the country, including in Kandahar, where they killed like more than 1,000 people in one district in less than a month. Nobody covered that. Everybody was focused on the Kabul airport. Of course, there was like thousands of civilians who wanted to be evacuated by the international troops, mainly by Americans. But there was another reason for the interest. There was American soldiers there, American troops. When they left, international media left as well. So there was not much interest on the ordinary people's lives, and the big slogans like human rights, freedom of expression, women's rights, marginal communities' rights, and this and that. That unfortunately happened, and we witnessed that. I have friends among the international media. They were not ready to listen to us, or their editors were not ready at that time to listen to anything we were saying. We were considered kind of the naysayers, or pessimists who are not ready to accept the new reality on the ground. Unfortunately, that happened, and I still see signs of the same trend. especially with the beginning of the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion on Ukraine. You see the difference of these two countries and the population in the eyes of the international media. The BBC and British government have refused to be helpful, while for their own rights, and I totally appreciate that. Almost every British citizen is allowed to bring in any Ukrainian citizens. We even heard from some very credible reporters and credible international media that this is Ukraine. They are people like us. They are not Afghanistan. They don't look like Afghans. They look like white. So that's part of the life that we have been experiencing.
It's the same here. I think America has taken in over 100,000 Ukrainians, but they all have sponsors, because they all have sponsors. They do. There is a big Ukrainian community in America. There's one in Canada, and so you can have enough sponsors to privately bring people in, and it's not fair, but it is there. I want to do one last thing, because we've got 5 minutes left. So if you, by some quirk of fate, became the editor of the New York Times and you called up whoever is covering Afghanistan, what stories would you ask them to do right now that would give an international audience a real sense of what's going on? And I think I'll start with Summia, and then Zahra, and then Sami.
Yeah, I think that's a tough question.
You're a new journalist, so it's harder for you. I expect you to know.
I think I would definitely focus on, I think going back to the earlier point I made, I think it's very important to ensure that we're bringing stories of individuals who have maybe not been covered or their voices have not been heard, of communities. But also, I think educate people about different, ethnic tensions that exist in Afghanistan. I think there's lack of acknowledgement on that when it comes to international media's approach, and whether that's like New York Times or any media outlet. I think it's very important that we talk about it, and we don't look at Afghanistan as this like united front country or like a homogenous body. I think it's very important that we look at different issues that pertain to different ethnic groups and what they're trying to advocate and different issues, and cover those stories and ensure that they have journalists from communities who know what is going on in their community. Because the way things work in Afghanistan is that it's really hard to hear people share their vulnerabilities unless they trust you, especially with what's going on in the country. And it's important to find people within those communities and allow them, journalists in those communities, and hear their voices and their issues and cover those. So I'd really emphasize on that. Yeah.
Okay. Zahra, probably you're already producing and assigning exactly what I'm asking about. So what would you do? What would be your top story? Not so much, remember that now this is for a Western audience. What do you want them to know?
Sure. I think Afghanistan would be like a black box of like full of undercover stories. Like there's so much story that you can look in Afghanistan, especially now. Like this is like a different world now, like you can feel like you're going to an ancient society where like people are being executed, like flagged on the sport stadium. Like that's like totally, a different world now. We are talking about a different Afghanistan. So what like at top of my mind, if I would be like commissioning a story for the New York Times, that would be a story of like, let's say like there is estimated 20 million women in Afghanistan. There is no legal system to support them. There is no organization that count or take status of like how they do suffer, what's the statistics on like domestic violence, what's the statistics on the gender-based violence. So we used to have a Ministry of Women Affairs that was also supporting women, running shelters, doing some work for women in Afghanistan. Then we have Independent Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan, which also would investigate, would document violence against women, and would also somehow investigate these cases. They're all gone. How do women of Afghanistan live now? Like when their husbands, like, because of course we know that the Taliban give the authority to men to do whatever they're free to do with women in their houses. But if they go out without the face covering, the men would be punished. So they also take the agency from Afghan women to exert, to resist the Taliban by themselves. So what's life like for them? Like if a woman is, I don't know, there's so many scenarios that you can look into, you know, like if a woman is being, so we have one story that we couldn't cover, but I can tell it here. There was one woman whose husband was in the West, who fled like in Europe, and then this woman, she wanted to get a divorce from her husband. Then the husband paid somebody, the Taliban, to go and hit his like father-in-law and put them in prison. And this woman, like there's so many complicated story of like, now this woman, she has nowhere to go, her father is in the prison, and her brother is like, you just can't imagine what this woman should do in order to get justice. There is no justice for her. Like, because if you go to the Taliban, they would just say, you know, you have to do whatever your husband is telling you, you know, if he doesn't want to give you a divorce, you're done. You shouldn't be getting a divorce. So like, I would be telling that story from all angles. Like, how do 20 million people live in a society that they don't have rights, that there is no legal system put in place to protect them? How is their situation?
Very good. Sami, what would you do? What does the West need to know?
I mean, all the things that Summia and Zahra said are very, very valid. And but you know, remembering the interest of the Western media in Afghanistan, I would suggest two stories. First, how the international aid is being spent by the Taliban. Nobody is covering that. There is no access. And the Western countries have sent $1.7 billion to Afghanistan since Taliban. Yeah.
Since the Taliban, wow.
Yeah. There is $40 million going to Afghanistan on weekly basis. How is that spent? And how do we know that Taliban are not using that to suppress women, to suppress minorities, to, you know, help and support their terror affiliates? That's the first topic. The second topic is, I think the international media should keep an eye on the re-emergence or new emergence of terror groups with global agenda. That's happening in Afghanistan, and you see that you know, the Chinese nationals were attacked yesterday. 2 weeks ago, the Pakistani embassy was attacked. 3 months ago, Russian embassy was attacked. And we see, you know, the movement of some terrorists across the country. We had a report about Al-Qaeda members moving to the northern province of Baghlan, and challenging the claim by the Taliban and the belief by the Americans that Taliban are going to be their new allies in the new war against terror.
Those are all great stories. This has been a fun hour. Fun, that's probably not exactly the right characterization, but I can see why journalism was such a jewel in Afghanistan. All of you are great representatives in a profession that I certainly revere. And I want to thank you, Summia, Zahra, Sami. You are just fabulous representatives of Afghan journalism. And I hope that people who are listening to this will take some of those stories and run with them. And I thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.